Chapter 1. A Scene from Childhood. Andrew Stillway clenched his fists so tightly that his nails dug into his skin, leaving painful marks. He stood in the hallway of the old house, filled with cold and dampness. The house was silent, too silent for a typical Friday evening. Usually at this time, Andrew would be sitting in the kitchen with his stepfather, Gregory, listening to stories about the long roads and the people Gregory met on his travels. But today was different. His mother, Carolyn, sat in the living room, arms crossed over her chest. Her gaze was cold and sharp like the edge of a knife. There was no trace of warmth on her face, no hint of a smile. Andrew knew this look all too well. It was the look she gave him every time he disappointed her. But this time there was something more in her eyes, something new, a mixture of contempt and hatred. "You've let me down again, Andrew," she said in an icy tone. Her words hit harder than any physical blow. "No wonder everyone around sees you as useless." Andrew stayed silent. A lump in his throat made it hard to breathe. He didn't know what to say. He was only 10 years old, but he had already learned that any excuse or attempt to explain himself would only make things worse. "Gregory doesn't have to put up with you," Caroline continued, not taking her eyes off her son. "He could be living his life peacefully without any worries, but no, he spends his time on a worthless boy like you." Hearing his stepfather's name spoken so venomously was the final straw for Andrew. He knew that Gregory was the only person in his life who truly cared about him. It was Gregory who taught him how to ride a bike, how to fix the old car in the garage, and how to endure hardship stoically. Gregory was the model of what a man should be, and now Caroline was trying to tear down the one support Andrew had, making him feel even more alone. The door swung open and Gregory walked into the room. He was covered in grime, his face tired but kind. He held a heavy tool bag in his hands, tools he had just used to repair his truck. Seeing the tense scene, Gregory frowned and immediately turned his attention to Andrew. "Andrew, come here," he called gently, extending his hand. The boy rushed to his stepfather as if escaping a storm. Gregory bent down and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, silently telling him that he was there, that nothing would change that. Andrew struggled to hold back tears, knowing that Gregory wouldn't approve of them. "It's all right, son," Gregory said, his calm and confident tone drowning out Caroline's icy voice. "You're strong for holding on. In life, there will be people who try to break you, but don't let them. You're stronger than you think." These were words Andrew had heard many times before, but this time they took on a new meaning. He understood that Gregory wasn't just talking about people on the street. He was also talking about those closest to him, about his mother. Caroline sneered and left the room, throwing a look full of disgust. In that moment, Andrew decided he wouldn't let her control his life. But he also knew that ahead of him lay years of struggle. Struggle for respect, for his identity, and for the right to be happy. Gregory, seeing the resolve in the boy's eyes, smiled slightly and tousled his hair. "Come on, Andrew. We have more important things to do than listen to her lectures." Andrew nodded and followed him into the garage, where the cold and dampness gave way to warmth and safety. But even amidst the noise of tools and the smell of engine oil, Andrew couldn't shake the feeling that this struggle was only beginning. Chapter 2. Secrets of Jennifer. Many years had passed since Andrew first encountered his mother's icy gaze. He had grown up, but the memories of that time remained etched in his heart like scars from deep wounds. Now he was on the brink of a new life full of hope and dreams. Andrew stood at the altar, looking at Jennifer, his future wife. She was stunning in her white dress, her eyes glowing with happiness and the promise of a bright future. Guests filled the small hall of the old church, adorned with flowers and candles. It seemed that even the place itself was blessing their union. Jennifer held a bouquet of roses, her smile so sincere that Andrew felt his past dissolving in this moment. He believed that with her, he would finally have the family he had always dreamed of. But behind this idyllic exterior, something dark was lurking, something Andrew could not even suspect. Jennifer was a woman with secrets, and those secrets would soon begin to unravel their marriage from within. The first few months after the wedding felt like a fairy tale. Jennifer seemed like the perfect wife, caring, affectionate, and supportive. Andrew worked tirelessly to provide for her and their future child. Jennifer was pregnant, and every evening they would talk about what their child would be like, what traits he or she would have, and who they would grow up to be. But gradually, strange things began to happen in Jennifer's behavior that Andrew couldn't ignore. She started taking long walks alone, without telling him where she was going. Her phone conversations became more frequent and more secretive. Andrew tried to brush it off, attributing it to pregnancy hormones and stress, but deep down, he knew something was wrong. One evening, when Jennifer was late coming home from the city, Andrew couldn't sleep. He sat in the kitchen, turning a cold cup of coffee in his hands, pondering what might have changed. Worrying thoughts swirled in his mind, but he didn't want to believe the worst. Jennifer had always been open with him, always shared her thoughts and feelings. Why had things changed now? Finally, he heard the front door quietly open and close. Andrew got up and walked to the door to greet his wife. Jennifer entered the house, trying to act as usual, but her eyes avoided his gaze. She mumbled something vague about meeting a friend, but her voice was uncertain. Andrew felt a cold knot of anxiety tighten in his chest. "Where were you?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Jennifer froze for a moment, then quickly smiled as if brushing off his words. "Just out with Liz," she said, dropping her purse on the table. "We were talking about the baby. You know how it is. Everything's fine, Andrew." He nodded, though something in her behavior was off. He could feel it. Something elusive, like a sinister shadow, was creeping into their relationship. But Andrew didn't want to press Jennifer. He trusted her, and that trust was becoming his weakness. As time went on, the oddities continued. Andrew noticed more and more how Jennifer avoided serious conversations, how she distanced herself from him. He tried not to dwell on it, believing that the upcoming birth of their child would bring them closer together. He thought that once the baby arrived, their family would become stronger. But one day, when Andrew accidentally picked up Jennifer's phone to check the time, he saw a message that shocked him. "I miss you. When will we see each other again?" it read. The message was from an unknown number, and Andrew's heart stopped. He stared at the screen, unable to move. Thoughts raced through his mind. What does this mean? Who wrote this? Jennifer returned to the room and saw him holding her phone. For a moment, fear flashed in her eyes, but she quickly composed herself. "Andrew, it's just a friend," she said, trying to sound calm. "You don't need to worry." But Andrew could no longer ignore the growing sense of dread. This was the moment when his world began to crumble. He realized that Jennifer was hiding something, but he still didn't know how deep the secret ran. And so, what had started as a perfect love began to crack with fractures that would only deepen over time. Despite his belief in the best, Andrew began to understand that the woman he loved was not who she seemed. Chapter 3. The Beginning of the End. Several months had passed since Andrew first noticed the oddities in Jennifer's behavior. He tried to convince himself that it was just his paranoia, that nothing serious was happening, but the doubts kept growing, along with the feeling that his world was about to collapse. Outwardly, he continued to act as usual, going to work, planning for the future, helping Jennifer prepare for the birth of their daughter. But internally, Andrew was falling apart. One evening, when Jennifer was once again late from work, Andrew decided to confront her. He could no longer bear the uncertainty. He could no longer live with the constant feeling of betrayal. When she came home, tired and distracted, he met her at the door. "We need to talk," he began, trying to keep his voice calm, though he felt turmoil inside. Jennifer gave him a quick glance, one filled with worry, but she quickly turned away, pretending not to have heard. "Maybe later?" "I'm really tired, Andrew," she said, taking off her coat and heading to the bedroom. But Andrew wasn't going to let it go. He followed her, closing the door behind him. "No, Jennifer, we can't put this off any longer. What's going on? Why have you been avoiding me these past months? I can tell you're hiding something." She froze for a moment, then turned to him with a look of exhaustion and irritation. "Andrew, you're overthinking things. It's just stress, work, pregnancy. You're imagining problems where there aren't any." Andrew felt his patience wearing thin. He wanted to believe her, but deep down, he knew she was lying. He knew this wasn't just stress. "I saw a message on your phone," he said, his words sharp like a blade. Jennifer's face paled. Her eyes widened briefly, but she quickly regained her composure. "It's just a friend, Andrew," she said, her voice tense. "You need to trust me." "A friend?" Andrew felt the pressure building in his chest. "Then why are you trying so? Hard to hide him from me? Why won't you tell me who he is?" She looked away, avoiding his gaze. The room was silent, the only sound the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Andrew stood before her, waiting for an answer, but Jennifer remained silent. The tension reached its peak. He felt something inside him break. "I love you, Jennifer," he finally said, softening his tone. "But I can't live in constant lies. If there's something you need to tell me, do it now." Her shoulders slumped, and for a moment he saw fear and guilt in her eyes. But then she closed herself off again, putting on a mask of calm. "There's nothing, Andrew," she said quietly. "You're just worrying too much. We need to rest more and fight less." Andrew knew this wasn't the answer he needed. He knew something darker was hiding behind her words, but at that moment, he felt powerless. He stood before the woman he loved, unable to break through the walls she had built between them. All he could do was either trust her or wait for the truth to come out on its own. The night passed in uneasy silence. Andrew couldn't sleep, tossing and turning in bed while Jennifer lay quietly beside him. Thoughts of betrayal haunted him like thorns piercing his consciousness. He knew their relationship would never be the same again, that this conversation had marked the beginning of the end. The next day, Andrew decided to talk to someone he trusted. He called his brother Thomas, hoping for advice and support. They met at a cafe not far from Andrew's home. Thomas had always been a friend and a pillar of support for him, and Andrew hoped he could help him make sense of what was happening. Thomas listened to him attentively. But with each word, Andrew noticed a strange expression on his brother's face, a mix of worry and hidden anxiety. When Andrew finished speaking, Thomas leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Andrew, you need to be careful," he began slowly. "Sometimes our suspicions can destroy what we've worked so hard to build. Jennifer is a good woman, and she loves you. Maybe you should just trust her and not look for problems where there aren't any." Andrew stared at his brother, feeling his insides twist. Something in Thomas's tone was off. This wasn't the brother he had known all his life. His words sounded too detached, too confident. Andrew didn't understand why, but this only added another brick to the wall of doubt. When they parted, Andrew realized that the conversation had brought him no comfort. On the contrary, he felt trapped, where every step only brought him closer to the edge of an abyss. He knew a moment of truth was coming, but he had no idea how devastating it would be. It was at this moment that the inevitable process of the destruction of everything Andrew had once believed in began. Chapter 4. Conflict with the Daughter. Time flew by quickly. Jennifer had given birth to their daughter, and they named her Maggie. The first few years of Maggie's life seemed like a true blessing to Andrew. He adored his daughter and was ready to do anything to make her happy. But the shadow of doubt that had settled in his heart after that fateful conversation with Jennifer continued to grow. It lurked in the depths of his mind, waiting for its moment. When Maggie turned 10, changes began to occur in their home. Andrew noticed that Jennifer had become even more distant, especially when it came to Maggie. It seemed that she supported their daughter in everything, even when Maggie openly defied her father's authority. Maggie grew increasingly stubborn and rebellious, and every time Andrew tried to establish discipline, Jennifer would take her side. One evening, when Maggie once again began to act up and argue with Andrew during dinner, he couldn't take it anymore. "Maggie, enough. You need to respect me. I'm your father," he said, trying to keep his irritation in check. Maggie shot him a contemptuous look, filled with a hatred that seemed far too intense for her age. "You're not my father," she snapped, and her words cut through him like a knife. Andrew froze, as if struck. The room fell into an oppressive silence. Jennifer said nothing, continuing to eat as if nothing had happened. Her indifference was painful, only deepening the sense of alienation Andrew had been feeling for a long time. "Maggie," he began slowly, trying to keep his voice steady, "who told you that?" But Maggie only scoffed and turned away. "I know everything," she declared, and those words sounded like a verdict. Andrew felt the anger rising within him, but he understood that the problem wasn't just with Maggie. All this time, Jennifer had been undermining his authority in the family, and now the result was right before him. The daughter he loved with all his heart had turned against him. She no longer saw him as her father, no longer considered him her protector. After dinner, Andrew tried to talk to Jennifer alone. "What's going on, Jennifer?" he asked, barely containing his rage. "Why is Maggie acting like this? Why do you let her talk to me like that?" But Jennifer only shrugged. "She's just growing up. You need to be more patient." "Patient?" Andrew couldn't believe his ears. "You're saying I should just ignore the fact that she doesn't respect me?" Jennifer met his gaze, but there was no regret or sympathy in her eyes. "Maggie needs freedom, Andrew. You're too strict with her." Andrew wanted to argue, but the words caught in his throat. He realized that Jennifer would not support him, that she had taken Maggie's side, no matter whether she was right or wrong. This was not just a disagreement over parenting, it was betrayal. With each passing day, the relationship between Andrew and Maggie deteriorated further. She no longer listened to him, ignored his requests and demands. Jennifer only added fuel to the fire, always defending their daughter. Andrew felt cornered. He was losing control not just over the situation, but over his entire life. The breaking point came a few months later. Maggie, enraged by yet another restriction imposed by Andrew, threw her schoolbooks at him. "You're not my father, and you never were," she screamed, tears of fury streaming down her cheeks. Those words shattered Andrew into pieces. He realized that he could no longer remain in this family, which was rapidly falling apart before his eyes. But he also knew that he couldn't leave without getting to the bottom of things. He felt there was something more, something deeper, threatening to destroy everything he held dear. Andrew knew he had to find out the truth, no matter what it took. And this time, he wasn't going to stop until he did. Chapter 5. The First Revelation. After the conflict with Maggie and the growing alienation he felt in his own family, Andrew could no longer just sit and wait for things to get worse. An inner voice told him that there was more to this situation than met the eye, something hidden, something that was slowly tearing his life apart from within. That night, after Maggie's words echoed in his mind, he made a decision. He had to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The next morning, Andrew called his old friend Richard, a lawyer who specialized in divorce cases and private investigations. They arranged to meet at a small cafe on the outskirts of town, where no one could overhear them. Andrew knew that this step could lead to the destruction of his family, but he also understood that there was no turning back. Richard arrived on time, as always, looking elegant and confident. He sat down across from Andrew, studying his friend closely. "You look exhausted," he said instead of a greeting. Andrew sighed heavily. "I can't live like this anymore, Richard. Jennifer is hiding something, and I want to know what it is. And Maggie? She told me I'm not her father. I need to know the truth." Richard nodded thoughtfully, understanding the gravity of the situation. Do you want me to help with the investigation? Yes, Andrew replied. I can't stay in the dark any longer. If there's something I need to know, I want to find out now. Richard silently took out a notepad and pen. All right, I'll contact a private detective I know. He's a professional and can handle everything quickly and discreetly. But you need to be ready for whatever you might discover. Andrew nodded, feeling a mix of fear and determination growing inside him. He knew there was no turning back, and he was prepared to face whatever truth awaited him. Several weeks passed while Detective Lewis conducted his investigation. Andrew couldn't sleep at night, tormented by nightmares and anxious thoughts. He tried not to let Jennifer see his suspicions, but the tension in their relationship was palpable. They barely spoke to each other, and even Maggie began to avoid her father as if she knew something was brewing. One evening, when Andrew returned home from work, he found an unmarked envelope in the mailbox. Inside was a report from Lewis and several photographs. Andrew's heart pounded as he sat at the kitchen table, his hands trembling as he opened the envelope. The first thing he saw were photographs of Jennifer and Thomas, his brother, together. They were hugging, holding hands, and in one photo, even kissing. Andrew felt a cold wave of horror wash over him. Everything he had feared was true. Lewis had also included a copy of a DNA test which confirmed Andrew's worst suspicion. Maggie was not his daughter. She was Thomas's daughter. Andrew stared at the papers, unable to believe his eyes. How long had this been going on? How many years had he lived in ignorance, unaware that his own brother had betrayed him? His mind was flooded with memories, emotions, and thoughts. Everything he had once believed to be solid and reliable had turned out to be an illusion. He sat at the kitchen table, consumed by anger and despair, not knowing what to do next. The only thing he knew for certain was that he could no longer tolerate the lies. Now that he knew the truth, there was only one thing left to do: take action. That night, while Jennifer was asleep, Andrew remained in the living room, lost in thought. He understood that a difficult path lay ahead, but he knew he had to see it through. This lie had destroyed his life, and now he would do whatever it took to regain control. He made up his mind to strike back, a blow that would change all their lives forever. Chapter 6. The Scene of Revenge. Andrew didn't sleep at all that night. After discovering the truth about Jennifer and Thomas's betrayal, his thoughts revolved around one question: what should he do next? The anger, mixed with pain and disappointment, fueled an irresistible desire for revenge. But this revenge had to be calculated and devastating, one that would leave them with no chance of recovery. The next day, Andrew met with Richard to discuss his next steps. They sat in Richard's small office, the air thick with the scent of old books and tobacco. Andrew told his friend everything he had learned. Richard listened carefully, occasionally nodding, but there was a look of concern in his eyes. "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" Richard asked when Andrew finished. "This revenge could destroy not only their lives, but also yours." Andrew clenched his fists, his eyes glinting with determination. "I have nothing left, Richard. Everything I believed in was a lie. If they decided to ruin my life, I'll ruin theirs in return." Richard sighed, realizing he couldn't dissuade his friend. "Then you need to be smart about it. Make sure you have all the evidence so you're not left empty-handed. I'll help you with the legal side, but remember that every action has its consequences." Andrew nodded, and they began planning. His revenge wouldn't be just an emotional outburst. It would be a calculated strike that would completely destroy Jennifer and Thomas, leaving them defenseless against the consequences of their actions. The first step was to gather even more evidence. Lewis continued to monitor Thomas and Jennifer, providing Andrew with new photos, phone records, and financial documents that further confirmed their relationship. Everything was falling into place, creating a picture that Andrew intended to use to his advantage. Andrew also decided to involve one more person, his mother, Caroline. Despite her cruelty and coldness in the past, she remained an important figure in their family. Andrew knew that she was aware of the affair between Jennifer and Thomas, but had done nothing to stop it. Moreover, he suspected that she had even encouraged their relationship, making her another enemy. He invited Caroline to lunch at a restaurant. When she arrived, Andrew noticed how much she had changed. She looked even colder and more distant than ever. They exchanged the usual pleasantries, but behind their polite smiles lay mutual suspicion. "Mom," Andrew began, trying to keep his tone calm, "I know about Jennifer and Thomas, and I know you knew about it too." Caroline frowned slightly but quickly regained her composure. "I don't know what you're talking about," she replied coldly, but her voice betrayed her nervousness. "Don't pretend," Andrew said, tossing the photos Lewis had sent onto the table. "I've gathered enough evidence. Now the question is, what are you going to do about it?" Caroline froze for a moment, staring at the photos. Then she looked up at her son, her gaze hardening. "What do you want from me, Andrew?" "You're going to help me," he said firmly. "You understand that if this becomes public, your reputation will be destroyed. Your connections, your power, everything will disappear. So you'll do exactly what I say." She looked at him, searching for any sign of weakness, but Andrew didn't flinch. In that moment, he knew he was standing on the edge, where his revenge would either succeed or destroy him. But it was too late to turn back. Caroline nodded, acknowledging defeat. "What do you plan to do?" she asked, her voice dry and emotionless. "I want them to pay for everything," Andrew replied. "You're going to help me stage a public confrontation. I want it to happen in such a way that they can never recover." Caroline nodded in agreement, realizing that Andrew was no longer the boy she could control. He had become a man willing to use every tool at his disposal to achieve his goal. The plan for revenge was set in motion. Andrew prepared everything for Maggie's upcoming birthday when family and friends would gather together. He knew this would be a turning point for everyone, and he approached it with cold resolve. On the day of the party, guests began to arrive at Andrew's house. Everyone smiled, congratulated Maggie, unaware of the storm that was about to break. Jennifer, Thomas, and even Caroline were there, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Andrew observed them from a distance, masking his anger with a calm demeanor. When the time came, he stood in the center of the room and drew everyone's attention. "Dear friends and family," he began, his voice steady and confident. "Today is an important day for our family, and I have something important to share." Then he pulled out the photos, documents, and recordings he had gathered with Lewis's help. "I've endured lies and betrayal for too long," he continued, his voice growing colder and sharper. "But today, I want everyone to know the truth." He revealed the evidence to everyone present. The room fell into a heavy silence. Jennifer turned pale, her hands trembling as she saw the photos. Thomas looked stunned, unable to utter a word. Caroline stood off to the side, hiding her emotions, but her face showed a trace of satisfaction. Andrew approached Maggie and looked her straight in the eyes. "I've loved you despite everything, but you need to know the truth. I'm not your father. Everything I built was a lie, and now that lie ends." Maggie, still not fully understanding the weight of his words, began to cry, but Andrew could not comfort her. His heart was shattered, but the revenge was complete. He turned to Jennifer and Thomas. "I'm leaving. This house no longer belongs to us, and when all of this is over, I'll be far away. Now you both can reap the rewards of your betrayal." With those words, Andrew left the house, leaving behind broken lives and shattered souls. He knew that his revenge had brought him satisfaction, but he also understood that he would have to pay a high price for it. Chapter 7. The Meeting with Linda. A year had passed since Andrew sought refuge in the small coastal town. The time he spent with Linda had helped heal some of his wounds, but his heart was still burdened by the weight of the past. He knew that, despite his new life, he would never find true peace until he finished what he had started. One morning, waking up with a clear sense of what he needed to do, Andrew sat down at the table and wrote a letter. He sent it to Jennifer, Thomas, and Maggie, inviting them to meet at the house that had once been their family home. He knew this would be the last opportunity to say everything that had built up over years of lies, betrayal, and pain. The day of the meeting arrived. Andrew returned to his hometown, and as he stood in front of the house, his heart raced. This house, once a symbol of happiness and hope, now seemed cold and empty. Inside, everything was just as he had left it a year ago, but the air was heavy with memories that made him want to run away. Jennifer was the first to arrive. She looked exhausted, with none of her former confidence in her eyes. Thomas came in next, nervously fidgeting with his hands as if trying to cope with the tension inside him. Maggie was the last to arrive, now grown up and independent, but her face showed anxiety and doubt. They all sat in the living room, hesitant to speak first. Andrew looked at each of them, feeling a storm of emotions building inside him, but he knew it was time to bring this story to a close once and for all. "I asked you all here so we could talk," Andrew began, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not seeking forgiveness, nor do I expect you to understand me, but I can't live with this burden on my heart any longer." Jennifer tried to say something, but Andrew silenced her with a gesture. "Let me finish," he said gently but decisively. He spoke about what he had felt all these years, starting from the moment he began to suspect their betrayal. He talked about how his world crumbled when he learned the truth. He described his pain, the anger that drove him to revenge, and how that revenge had brought him no peace. He felt his heart lighten with each word, as if he were shedding the chains that had bound him for years. When Andrew finished, the room fell into a heavy silence. Thomas lowered his head, unable to meet his brother's gaze. Jennifer wept, realizing how much she had destroyed the life of the man she once loved. Maggie, her face full of pain and confusion, finally broke the silence. "Dad," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "I know you're not my biological father, but to me, you were always my real father, and I'm sorry for how I treated you. I was confused and hurt, but I never wanted things to end like this." Andrew looked at her, feeling his heart break. He realized that despite everything, Maggie was his daughter in the sense that he had loved and cared for her all those years. "I can't change what's happened," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "But maybe we can find a way to move forward, each of us on our own path." He then turned to Jennifer and Thomas. "You destroyed what we had, but I'm not blameless either. I took my revenge, and now you know what it's like to lose everything. But that revenge didn't bring me peace. It only brought more pain." Andrew stood up, knowing he had said everything he needed to. "I'm leaving, and I won't be coming back. I hope you all find a way to move on with your lives, each in your own way." He walked out of the house, feeling the weight lift from his shoulders. Linda was waiting for him in the car, ready to support him through this difficult moment. Andrew sat down beside her, and she silently placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, understanding that words were unnecessary. As the car drove away, Andrew looked back at the house where his family once lived. He knew that a new chapter awaited him, a life without hatred and bitterness. But he also knew that this life would be overshadowed by memories of a past he could never change. And though the future held new possibilities, Andrew understood that some scars remain with us forever, reminding us of what we lost in the pursuit of justice. Chapter 8. The Final Meeting. A year had passed since Andrew found refuge in the small coastal town. The time he spent with Linda had given him a chance to heal some wounds, but the burden of his past still weighed heavily on him. He knew that despite the new life he had begun, he would never find true peace until he put an end to what he had started. One morning, with a newfound clarity about what needed to be done, Andrew sat down and wrote a letter. He sent it to Jennifer, Thomas, and Maggie, inviting them to meet at the house that had once been their family home. He knew this would be the last chance to confront the pain, lies, and betrayal that had defined their lives for so long. The day of the meeting arrived. Andrew returned to his hometown, and as he stood in front of the house, his heart pounded in his chest. The house, once a symbol of happiness and hope, now seemed cold and empty. Inside, everything was exactly as he had left it a year ago, but the air was thick with memories that made him want to flee. Jennifer arrived first. She looked tired and worn, her eyes lacking the confidence they once held. Thomas followed shortly after, his nervous fidgeting betraying the tension he felt. Finally, Maggie arrived. Now, a young woman, independent but carrying an expression of anxiety and doubt. They all sat in the living room, unsure of how to begin. Andrew looked at each of them, feeling a storm of emotions building inside him. But he knew it was time to bring this painful chapter to a close. "I asked you all to come here so we could talk," Andrew began, his voice steady but resolute. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, and I don't expect you to understand me, but I can't continue living with this weight on my heart." Jennifer opened her mouth to speak, but Andrew stopped her with a gentle hand gesture. "Please, let me finish," he said, his voice firm yet calm. He spoke about everything he had felt over the years, starting from the moment he first suspected their betrayal. He described how his world shattered when he learned the truth. He recounted the pain and anger that drove him to seek revenge, and how that revenge brought him no peace, only more suffering. With each word, he felt the chains that had bound him for so long begin to loosen. When Andrew finished, a heavy silence filled the room. Thomas stared at the floor, unable to meet his brother's eyes. Jennifer wept quietly, realizing how deeply she had hurt the man she once loved. Maggie, her face filled with anguish and confusion, finally broke the silence. "Dad," she began, her voice trembling, "I know you're not my biological father, but you've always been my real dad. I'm sorry for how I treated you. I was lost and angry, but I never wanted things to turn out this way." Andrew looked at her, feeling his heart break all over again. Despite everything, Maggie was still his daughter in the way that mattered most. He had loved her and raised her as his own. "I can't change what's happened," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "But maybe we can all find a way to move forward, each in our own way." He then turned to Jennifer and Thomas. "You both destroyed what we had, but I'm not blameless either. I took my revenge, and now you know what it feels like to lose everything. But that revenge didn't bring me peace. It only added more pain." Andrew stood, knowing he had said all that needed to be said. "I'm leaving, and I won't be coming back. I hope each of you finds a way to live your lives apart from all this." He walked out of the house, feeling a heavy weight lift from his shoulders. Linda was waiting for him in the car, ready to support him through this final ordeal. Andrew got in beside her, and she placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, understanding that no words were necessary. As the car pulled away, Andrew looked back at the house where his family had once lived. He knew that a new chapter awaited him, a life without bitterness and hatred. But he also knew that this life would always be shadowed by memories of a past that could never be undone. Even as the road ahead opened up with new possibilities, Andrew understood that some scars remain forever, reminding us of what we lost in the pursuit of justice.